scientists, and we get to talk about science and how it can be so beneficial to the common good. I mentioned I'm Doug Padgett. You'll see Yaneer Bar-Yam here. He's our scientist for the day. You're going to hear more from him in a minute. Dan Dietrich is also with us. I'm in Minneapolis, and as I'm committed earlier this week, I am again standing up and not sitting down. So I feel like that's a goal accomplished. On our podcast, we like to take this open-eyed, really clear view of what's actually happening in the world, and then ask ourselves, what can we do about it and how can we be engaged? So pardon my lump in my throat. I'm in Minneapolis, as I mentioned. Please let us know in the chat, where are you coming from? What are you doing? How are you connecting? And we're going to want your input here on a thing called complex science, or complex system science. And that's what Dr. Bar-Yam is doing, and the work that he does, and especially how it relates to COVID and how we should be responding in this moment. So glad to have all of you with us. It's really good to be seen by you, good to be heard by you, and really good to see you on the chat. So please let us know when you're coming in. Dan, good morning to you. How are you feeling this morning?
Doing great. I'm sitting down. Unfortunately, that's just what my desk situation allows me to do. I'm sitting down in South Bend, Indiana. It's a beautiful, almost spring day here, so glad to be with y'all.
And good professor, thank you for being with us today. Where are you coming to us from?
From Boston.
Oh, yes. Hey, and your biography has you trained at MIT. So have you stayed in the greater Boston area for the bulk of your career?
Basically, yes, absolutely, yeah.
All right. So Complex Systems Institute that you run in the end of at the end of the coronavirus coalition is really interesting to us. We talked yesterday a bit about this. Obviously, everybody in the world is thinking about COVID. It feels like multiple times we've tried to approach this pandemic and human response to it with a lot of systems that weren't designed to deal with a pandemic, right? Whether that's how our cities respond, how our health system has responded. Our government in the first months of this seemed to really be confused about what to do and how to move forward. I would imagine somebody who has your expertise and studies something called complex systems science was saying regularly, like, some of us know what to do in this moment. Is that true? Did you find yourself yelling at your television or TV or your TV or your radio or internet?
No, I was talking about it starting toward the end of January. I put out my first piece, January 25th, 26th was when we put it out. And I've been saying the same thing mostly ever since, and I'm going to talk about it today, just so people really understand, what it's about. And I mean, there's been a lot of lost opportunity, but the main thing is you can't go back and change the past. So the most important thing is, what can we do now? And the answer is, it's still clear that we're quite confused about what we should be doing or can be doing, the choices that we have. And my hope is that everyone will feel like they have a new opportunity to take control of what's going on, and to make a difference in the society, because it's going to have, if change is going to happen, it's because everyone stands up, as Doug is doing, and says, I can make a difference. I can make a difference for myself, for my family, for my community. That's the most important thing. And together, communities can make a difference for the country and ultimately for the world we live in.
That feels very important to me. So many people have felt really lost and disempowered. Like, we just don't know what to do. And in the sense, kind of going home and closing your door and staying at home, there's something kind of comforting about it, but there's also something that feels like it's inactive, right? We're waiting. Everyone feels like they're waiting. And sometimes people feel like when they're told, trust the scientists, listen to the science, not very many people know how to understand science. They don't know how to think about the science. And all of that comes together to sort of breed this sense, as you mentioned, of people feeling disempowered. And then that comes out in lots of other ways, right? People burn masks, or they do all kinds of things around feeling disempowered. Can you talk a bit about what complex system science is and how that is a field of study that, first of all, that exists. I didn't know it existed and feel very good that it does, but what it is and how it relates to this particular moment that where we
Sure.
find ourselves?
So there are two ways that I would explain how to think about it. The first is that the language of science is math, and the biggest challenge is realizing, in fact, that science, and part of the reason why it's actually so confusing, is that a lot of the science has not been reliable. And the reason why it's not been reliable is that the language that it uses is what we all know as statistics.
Yeah.
And if you studied in college, of course, you also probably studied some calculus. And those languages of math turn out to be not complete. It's like you have words for certain things, but you don't have words for other things. And the most important thing that we don't have words for in statistics and calculus are dependencies, how something over here depends on what's happening over there. And because the language doesn't have it, there's been a gap between what science wants to talk about and what science can actually talk about. And so complexity science or complex system science allows us to develop the mathematics that goes beyond those tools. Now, if we want to understand it in the context of the pandemic, there's a way to think about a tool that I use that was developed a while ago at this point, in 1970, to deal with certain problems in physics that we couldn't deal with using calculus and statistics. But the way to explain it is, imagine you have a car and you don't remember, or you never learned how to drive the car. And you can think about this car as like the pandemic, right? Because the pandemic is something that we want to be able to control. And so here you have this car, it's sitting in your driveway, and you walk out to it and you want to control it.
Yeah.
Well, it would be super helpful if you knew that the most important thing was the steering wheel, the gas and the brakes, and the gear shift. Because if you knew that, then you could probably play with it if you were careful and figure out how to make it work. But if you didn't know that that was where you needed to go, well, you might be sitting in the back seat, or you might be playing with the trunk, or whatever it is, and you wouldn't be able to figure out. It would take you a really long time to be able to figure out how to drive the car. So the key tool that you need is to figure out what are the variables, what are the things you can change that will enable you to control that car. And same thing with a pandemic. So I started studying pandemics 15 years ago, and I applied this mathematical method, and that told me what were these parameters that you needed in order to control the outbreak. And that's how I got into understanding pandemics. And I saw that there was a lot of misunderstanding in science about how pandemics could work. But the truth is that everything that I discovered is in some sense known. It's kind of 1,000-year-old stuff. But when you get to modern science with the mathematical methods that we're using in modern science, we kind of forgot about the most important things that you need to know when dealing with pandemics. So it's actually not so much the new knowledge, but the knowledge that is old knowledge that we used 1,000 years ago. In fact, it goes back to the Bible, how to control diseases. And if we remember those things, then we actually know how to do things that we need to do in order to stop. And that's a key word that I'm going to say. We want to talk about in a minute. Yes, to stop the coronavirus. So let me go back, and maybe you want to start asking questions about the pandemic, because I can roll right into it.
Well, yeah, I just want to hear a little more. Dan, I know you have a question too, but Professor, I want to hear a little bit more about when you say there's a set of tools that hasn't been used, that's outside of the typical calculus and statistics, that really can be key to understanding what this car is and how it goes. What's the makeup of those tools, or what is that tool? What is that tool set?
So we discovered it in the context of phase transition, like boiling water. You go from water in its liquid state and you boil it and it ends up as a vapor, right? It goes in the room. And that process of that transition turns out to have a lot of subtleties. And the key subtlety is that when you boil, right, you have bubbling of water. But the point is that you have things that are visible at a macroscopic scale that can happen. And because you have macroscopic scale, there are dependencies, like where you have bubble, it can be a large bubble. And so if you want to describe it, you have to describe macroscopic things. Now, if you take the average, if I just take the average density of the water, it's not going to describe what's happening. Right? So if you didn't describe what's happening, you're going to get the math wrong. You're going to have the wrong understanding of what's happening. So the key thing in this new math is to understand how the system behaves, not only microscopically, but all the way up to the macroscopic scale. And in fact, focus on what matters at the macro scale, at the large scale. Once you do that, you know what the key variables are in the problem. And once you know what the variables are, now I can say, okay, I can push on these variables and I can control it. Because is it clear, right? It's the steering wheel that controls the entire car. So if you know what is that thing that you can move, then you can say, okay, now I know what to do. Well, I have to do a little bit of gas and a little bit of steering and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But these are the only very few things that we have in order to control this. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. So it sounds like some of the successes that we've seen in science used a set of tools, statistics, calculus, all kinds, and gave us great benefits. But
That's
this
right.
particular set of issues that we're facing with the pandemic is not treated by that set of tools, is not responded to by that set of tools as effectively as an additional set of tools.
That's right. In fact, really, there's a domain that you cannot describe. And the reason why it becomes confusing is you would think that you would be able to figure out what the right variables are using calculus and statistics. But when you try to do that, you end up thinking, well, maybe it's the ashtray, or maybe it's maybe I have to push on the wheel, right? Because if I can say, well, the wheel correlates with the motion of the car. So maybe I should go down there and start turning the wheel of the car, maybe this tire or that tire, right? So the point is that it confuses you. And if you notice, this is what the confusion has been like with the pandemic. Is this important? Is that important? What about this over here? Maybe it's that down there. And that's exactly the confusion that we've all experienced with the pandemic. But this is true about many problems. It's like market crashes, or why are people fighting each other? Or why are people, all around the world, there are all of these problems. Poverty. What's the reason for poverty? Maybe it's this, maybe it's that. Do I push over here? Do I push on that? And you get so confused that you don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm. So you've got this new set of tools. You've been studying this for 15 years, pandemics specifically for 15 years.
But I'm doing this work on the science for over 30 years.
Yeah. And so you've got this toolbox, and this current pandemic happens. We talked a little bit before the show started that just about a year ago to the day, the WHO declared this a global pandemic, and you said it was about a month and a half too late. Tell us how your toolbox helps us deal with COVID specifically.
So the main thing is, it's the reason why you want to know something is you can anticipate what you want to do. Because the point is that it's easy to deal with a problem that you wait until you're in trouble and then you deal with it. Now, if you're standing and a wrecking ball is headed for you, if you wait until you feel the wrecking ball, it's a little bit late.
Yeah, right. Unless you're really fast.
I mean, once it hits you, there's not much.
Yeah.
So the point is that this is what I mean by a month and a half too late. People waited until the wrecking ball hit us. And so at the end of January, I tried to get people to realize that this wrecking ball was coming. Now, the wrecking ball is a little bit subtle because the way it grows is it grows slowly at first and then boom, right? That's what exponential growth looks like. So everyone says, oh, we only have a few cases. It's not that bad. It hasn't. But the point is that some people think that you have to prove something by getting hit by a wrecking ball before you do something. And that's what's been happening over and over and over again by this pandemic. Said, oh, we got hit by a wrecking ball. Okay, well, the wrecking ball now moved away. Maybe we won't be hit next time. Hey, so why don't we wait and we'll see whether the wrecking ball hits us the next time on the back of the head instead of on the front of the head, right? So this is what we've been doing. And the main thing about it, the reality, the world as it exists, is that, when you get hit, it hurts.
Yeah.
So the real question is, what do we do? How do we think about a problem, right? So if you think about the trajectory of this wrecking ball, or, if you want the car, whatever is the picture you want to hold in your mind, if you know what's going to happen when you do something, or when you don't do something, and what's most important is the difference, right? See, a lot of people say, how do I predict what's going to happen with the pandemic? And I'm like, that isn't the right question.
Oh.
It's what's the difference between if I stand over here and I stand over there. That's what matters the most.
Interesting.
I can predict it. I predicted the wrecking ball hit me. Great. Beautiful.
Yeah, I was going to say that feels fundamental to what you're suggesting is the difference between predictive response and having choices about which outcome do you want to see in reality.
Yeah. And so what we've had is we've had governments in much of the world, not all of the world, in much of the world, and even experts, right? Healthcare experts. By the way, the pandemic is not a medical problem. This is one of the tremendous confusions about what matters and what doesn't matter. What you don't want to have is people who get sick altogether. If people don't get sick, then you don't need doctors to fix them. And the reason is that in a pandemic like this, even if you have the best doctors, many people die. So the best thing to do is to prevent them from getting infected in the first place. So sometimes doctors are really important when you get sick. But if we think that the getting sick is what matters and doctors are what's important, then we miss the fact that we actually should have stopped people from getting sick in the first place. So if we do the work right, we wouldn't have to be fighting this pandemic altogether. And that's what I was saying in the end of January. We didn't have to let it get here. How many people wouldn't choose today, right? This is the retroactive knowledge, to go back and say, look, why don't we just stop travel from everywhere for a few weeks and stop the disease? China stopped the disease. They don't have it there anymore. And if we had stopped the disease from coming to the United States right at the beginning, and maybe there was a case or two, but now we know how to stop it, right? We would quarantine people. We would do contact tracing. We know all of those things today.
And you're
so
saying
if at the time we had done these things, we would have been done with this in a few weeks and not very many people would have gotten sick.
And you're saying the reason we didn't was not because people didn't know what the choices were in responding to a pandemic. That was known, you're saying, but other influences caused us as a nation to make decisions to respond differently than what we knew we should do? Or are you saying people in decision-making situations didn't know what to do? They had information that told them this is the right thing to do. Which do you think was going on?
So it's a little bit of confusion, right? So let's talk about that, talk it through for a moment. So the first thing is that the paper that I wrote, along with a couple of colleagues in January, including the paper that I wrote, actually had influence on the US policy. You remember that there were these travel restrictions on people coming from China. That was partly, as far as I understand it, I've been told, influenced by what we wrote. But it wasn't taken seriously enough. Right? Part of the problem is that it's like, it's like saying, okay, I'm going to move back a half an inch when this wrecking ball is going to hit me. Either you get out of the way or what you do is not important. So, the point is you got to go, and this is, when you get hit by a wrecking ball is headed for you, you got to go all out. You got to say, I'm going to get out of here, right? It doesn't matter if you go further away. Once you're not hit, you can figure out what you want to do next.
It seems like one of the human struggles that we have is that if you do the right thing, like say we had shut down, nobody came in, we went into a quarantine for 4 weeks, people in this country would have had a hard time imagining what the alternative would have been. We have a hard time really wrapping our minds around it now. I can imagine the political, social pushback on, we shut down all this stuff and nothing happened.
Exactly.
You literally hear that now. So how do you, nothing happened, which is the point, to keep it from happening. And so how that must be in the calculation for just the human response to these realities, these truths.
Yeah.
How in complex systems do you do this when you say, well, let's have a circumstance where we don't have this problem, and then people say, well, there really was no problem in the first place. You were just over. It's
like the boy that cried wolf.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the key thing here is that it turns out a lot of people are afraid of being the boy that crawled wolf instead of being the person that prevents, everyone from being torn apart by the wolf. And the key thing is that we knew that, honestly, there are a couple of issues. First of all, the reason why many countries did do the right thing, and that includes Taiwan and China and Vietnam and Singapore and Thailand, is because they already had experience with SARS, which is a very, very similar disease. And SARS scared them. It said, look, if this one we were able to stop, the next one is going to be much worse, because they stopped it. And they were successful, but they knew at that time that they had to be prepared for what might happen next. And so they did. And Taiwan stopped the disease from really getting in the country almost at all, just like I described. They did have to do a bunch of stuff, and they've been doing stuff until now, but mostly they avoided the wrecking ball completely. And then you have other countries that watched, and that includes Australia and New Zealand. And they said, we saw China get rid of this. We can do that too. And the key thing was, even though the virus was already in the country, the main thing that they did was they realized that they had to act fast, act strong, get ahead of it. So that they were the ones that sort of started getting hit by the wrecking ball and said, okay, time to get out of here. And they got a little bit bruised, but it didn't break their noses or their faces. So they were able to do that.
The same day that I heard about the Zero COVID project, when we were prepping for this, was the same day that I heard a reporter, science reporter person say, hey, look, we just got to get comfortable with the fact that we're going to have COVID in our society, just like we have Ebola is still around. It's never going to go away. That shouldn't be the goal. we
Wait a
shouldn't do
second, is
that.
Ebola in New York? I didn't notice that.
Well, that's what I literally said to my wife in the kitchen. Do people still get Ebola in this country? Like, I'm hearing this person say that, but these feel like two different responses to this moment. One saying you can never seal off the country, can't possibly do it, both because it's just too big, the economy, and freedoms, right? Because I heard people saying back in January, like, they're shutting this down in China, but what they're doing is going to people's houses that have the illness, taking them out of their houses and putting them in a quarantine building. And then people said, we will never do that in the United States, almost as a positive, right? Like, hey, in this country, we're never going to force you to do such and such. So which is it? Like, is it we're never going to be able to stop something like this in this country and respond to a pandemic because of the conditions of our circumstance, and we just have to learn to live with it? Or are you saying, no, there's actually another way that we could have gone on this?
So so there are many different issues that you raised. And let me start with one. The first one is, remember the issue of scientific understanding that I talked about? So there are many public health experts and people who are the quote considered to be experts who don't have experience with outbreaks. You know, Africa has done much better than the United States and Europe. And people are saying, why? I don't understand why. Maybe they're young, maybe they're not fat, maybe they're this, maybe they're that. But those don't stop transmission, and they stop transmission.
Mm.
And the reason that they stopped transmission is they took the pandemic seriously and they responded. They're struggling. It's hard. They don't have a lot of resources to fight it. Even India has stopped it, and they stopped it in the worst slums in Asia. But they took it very seriously. Now, let's talk about an example that you used about, hey, you know, people, they took them out of their houses and they took them into isolation visit. Mm-hmm. Well, has any here gone to a hospital and stayed in the hospital for a while? Yeah. I mean, if you have a disease, you should go to a place where you can get cared for. Why would you want to stay at home and infect your family? I mean, this might be reasonable for people who don't give a damn about their family. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I've never understood this idea of doctors sending people home to their family to infect their family after they've discovered that they have a disease that will infect their family. Mm. And so the alternative is actually the other way around. You set up a place, a care facility, where people actually get care, because you can actually get worse very quickly from this disease. There are people who are just got a test, they didn't feel anything, and dropped dead. Yeah. Because there were nobody around to know that they were not doing well. And so what you want to do is you want to set up a place where people get cared for. It doesn't have to be a full hospital, but it does have to be a place where people are provided with the kind of care that you need when you're sick, which is good food, people paying attention to whether you're getting worse symptoms and stuff like that. And this was done in the US. Yeah. Saying that this would not be done in the US doesn't make any sense. We did it in New York, we did it in California, we did it in other places. Well, how did they do it? They set up hotels, they used fancy hotels. People went to hotels for a couple of weeks. Not so bad. So the point is that if you think about it as they forced people to go there, it's very different than if you say, people care about their families. They want to make sure that they don't infect their families. The doctor said, hey, why don't we set you up in this place where you'll make sure that we'll do the best that we can to prevent you from infecting your family. So this is really a problem of narrative. And that's number one. Number two, this whole idea of freedom is a very interesting one. The people who defeated this disease for most of the months of last year and this year, they're enjoying normal life. Yeah. They're going to concerts. They're going to barbecues. They're going to sports events without any concerns about being infected or infected someone else, taking their families and having a great time, going to restaurants, businesses open. And this is one of these misconceptions. Business says, we got to open up. But here's where this paradox comes in, where if you don't know how to drive a car, you feel like, well, maybe there's a trade-off between using the brakes and using the steering wheel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're
Right?
pushing
If you
both of them at
brake,
the same
you can't
time.
steer that.
Yeah.
But the point is that with a pandemic, if you understand things, you realize that the opportunity is that when you're braking, you brake, and then you go down a different road.
Do you think, so in the United States, people have acted as if what we did with the shutdown, statewide mask mandates when in public, was as draconian, as severe, as extreme as you could ever get. And then the argument is, should we be less extreme? I hear you saying, and I don't mean extreme in a bad way, but you're saying, oh, hang on a minute, there's something much more comprehensive and aggressive that we could have done. So what we did was not the most aggressive, and we should get less aggressive. You're saying, because that's an argument that I hear. It's just like, hey, let it run its course. That's what we should have done. You're saying, no, we should have done even more significant response.
The point is that more is really not like that. It's like, let's say you did find the car, the brakes, the steering wheel, and you sort of pulled on it this way, pulled on it that way. It didn't end up where you wanted to go. You say, well, I'll never do that again. I mean, it's really, we did everything that we needed to do in principle. We just didn't do it in the right order or in the right way. Mm-hmm. So all of this business about we wouldn't do that, right? So we have this crazy dichotomy of saying we wouldn't do what they would do in China. But the truth is we did everything that they did in China. It's just we didn't do it very well.
So Trump was
it's
saying,
like we're hitting ourselves on the head with whatever, we're banging our head against whatever you want. The point is the following. There is a good way to do this, and we almost did enough. And that's what's really terrible, because I was watching, remember, I knew all this stuff.
Yeah.
At the time. And I was watching what we were doing, and some people were saying, well, we locked down, so we're going to be done with this in a few weeks, just like in China. And then the next people say, well, it didn't work, so maybe it just doesn't work for us. Mm-hmm. And the answer is none of the above. The answer is we didn't do the right thing. We did a half-baked job, doing half measures. It's not that we didn't do the restrictions that we need. We limited the freedom in the right way. But we didn't do the right things. So we did have people going to, quarantine centers and hotels and stuff like that. But we didn't care enough to do it well enough.
What should we have done? What would have been the right?
So the main thing is what we know now. I mean, you can write it down. Probably half of the people in the country know what to do. Number one, you prevent transmission, so everybody does as much as possible not to be with other people. You stay at home, that's the best choice, because then you're not with other people. But it's only so that you're not with other people so you don't get infected and you don't infect other people. That's number one. Number two is, if you have to be with other people, you take precautions. You wear a mask. You don't touch surfaces, or all kinds of things, and you don't go indoors. You stay outside. If you can be outside, it's much safer than being indoors, because the stuff sits in the air for hours like smoke in a room. And even that, there was a lot of confusion about, for no good reason. It's obvious. If anybody anybody who thinks about these things, the stuff is going to fall, and 6 feet away, you're not going to be in risk. That doesn't make any sense in most circumstances. Yeah. And it doesn't make any sense in this circumstance. So stay far away. And outdoors, how far away should you be? Well, it depends. If the air is blowing towards you, you're going to get it right in your face. So you want to be far away from people as much as possible. That's how you prevent it from being infected and infecting other people. The main thing is that if people don't get infected, the virus dies.
And you're saying
you want to kill the virus, you want to stop the infection.
And you're saying we didn't do those two things enough.
No, not yet enough. Let me say a few more things, but I want to talk about masks for a minute. This whole business about masks, we accept all kinds of restrictions in our lives. We don't park in handicapped spots. Nowadays, we take off our shoes when we go into the airport. all of these things that we do because we care about making sure that we are safe, that people are okay, that they're taken care of, because we care about others. Yeah. And this narrative about that we only care about ourselves, that was something that was on TV. It's not true about the people. I mean, yeah, maybe there's a percent of people in the country. I mean, they're the ones who are making all the noise, doing all of the nonsense. But almost everybody cares about other people, particularly caring about their family, caring about their community. And that narrative hasn't been told. And the reason it hasn't been told is one main reason is that why do you watch the news? You watch the news because it's scary, because it's frightening, because it's exciting, because it's crazy, because it doesn't make really any sense. And so the press is the one that's actually responsible for us not realizing that we care about each other. And that we really want to do the right things, and that some of the things that we can do to protect each other includes, the quote restrictions, like not parking in handicap spots.
Right. Yeah, we don't narrate very well in our society when we do well with each other, do we? And there's something about like your mind. I think I was walking down the street, on my street here, and one set of neighbors, they were out in the driveway and they were having some fun. And I kind of looked over and waved, and then neighbor down the other side yelled something really aggressive, like he was trying to get someone's attention. And my head turned, my energy shifted. People having a normal, decent time was just unable to compete with one shout from the other side of the street. And so, yeah, I guess it is the press, but I think it's also all of us that that's the stuff we pay attention to and remember and share.
But the reason
and
we
talk
pay
about
attention to is because it's not okay.
Right.
And the point is that what we need to do, I mean, there are polls that say 80% of people in the country want to do the right thing, even if they haven't been explained everything correctly. They still are trying their hardest to do the right thing. And you go back to why, of the nature of community and all of the basis of our beliefs, and everything is just about making sure that we take care of each other. And it's not that we've lost it. We have it. It's just, if it's like, what the things that make you laugh are the things that don't make sense.
Right.
The things that attract attention are the things that are unreasonable.
Yeah.
And so that's what the press is talking about. So have you ever been to a basketball game, a professional basketball game, and you look at what's happening in the audience? And I've been to a basketball game, and you say, look, exactly where the camera is pointing, that's where people are shouting, "Yay!" Right? And so nobody else, everyone there is sitting and eating their lunch, right? And right where the spotlight is, that's where everyone's cheering. So this is what we're seeing in the press. So everything that you look at in the news is exactly where someone is shouting, and so on, exactly where the people are going to the restaurant, because that's what people shouldn't be doing. And so that's what creates the norm. That's what tells us, well, if everybody else is doing, then maybe I should do that too. So what we've done is we've amplified the lack of values rather than the values. And what we really needed, and this has happened multiple times, and it works even in the United States, is when a leader stands up and says, this is a tremendous challenge. We're really fighting for something that's super important. And in order to be successful, we can't just have the experts do what they need to do. This is not their role. This is not a government role. This is something that we all do together. And that's what pandemics are about. Because the transmission doesn't happen in the hospital, it doesn't happen in the doctor's office, it doesn't happen but it does happen in the community, and it also happens where people go to work. So it's a responsibility of all of us to take the actions that we need to do in order to stop it. And I stopped in the middle because I wanted to do this diversion, but let's talk about the other things that we need.
Please, yeah.
The next thing we need to do is to make sure that the places that people have to go to work are safe. So this means business leaders and workers have to all get together and say, okay, we don't want transmission. We want to stop it. And you have to create ventilation. You have to have masking. You have to have distancing, whatever is needed. And the payoff from doing that is that we really can stop transmission. Mm-hmm. And then there is what happens if someone does get sick. And if someone does get sick, well, there you have it, right? First of all, you want to know as soon as possible. Everyone has to be careful to let us know they have symptoms. And they have, so the point is that people have to be trusted. You have to have the best thing to do is have neighborhood members. There's what's called a door-to-door process. You have to check in on everybody, see if they're okay. Do they have symptoms? Do they need some help? What's going on in their lives so that, make sure that, so the main thing of the door-to-door process is in a time of crisis, you want to check that everyone's okay. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons they may not be okay, maybe they don't have food, right? But one of the reasons they may be not okay is that they have symptoms, and then you have to take them, as we said, we have to make sure that they don't infect the rest of their families. So you want to isolate, quarantine people that have been exposed, and stop the transmission. So that's another set of things you have to do. Well, how it happens when people are sick. So those are the important things about that. The one thing that we've had a really hard time wrapping our minds around is travel restrictions.
Yeah.
And travel restrictions, I want to talk about at different levels. So there's national travel restrictions. We don't want people coming into the country who are going to infect us. Now, in order to understand all of this, time is super important. Remember, this is, the driving business with the steering wheel and the brakes and so on. We have to know what the end game is. Where are we getting to? Nice. And so one of the big challenges is realizing that how long we have to do this is important. Right? We've been now doing pandemic for a year.
Right.
Super terrible. How long would it take us to get to the situation that China is in now, or Australia or New Zealand or Taiwan or so on? Even Atlantic Canada, by the way. A huge, major part of Canada is without the disease. So how long would it take? And the answer is, if we did all of the right things, it would take 4 to 6 weeks for most of the United States to get out of this completely.
Like you're saying, if we increase the shutdown stuff because we've done, I hear you saying, and it feels to me like we've been doing bits and pieces of this. You're saying if we did it full on in 4 weeks, that virus would have.
Most of the country.
Wow.
Towns, communities would be done in 4 weeks. 6 weeks in most of cities. Maybe there are a few, hot spots that would take a couple more weeks. And the reason is that you stop it. You know what to do to push the brakes. Then you can stop your car. If you don't know pushing on the brakes, then you're going this way, that way, this way, that way, and maybe eventually you'll stop.
Now let me just make sure I clarify here, because people, the one of the narratives is you bend the arc, right? We talked about this yesterday on this podcast. But the big push has been you get people to behave in a certain way so you don't overwhelm the healthcare system, and you just bring it down. Sounds to me, and from the name of the project that you have, Zero COVID, you have a different goal in mind. You don't want to simply bend the.
So the point is the following. Why would we want to live with this disease? It's a horrendous disease.
Okay.
So the question is there an exit, right? If there's a door with an exit on it and you can go through it, then why not? Huh. So the point is that realizing that there is an exit, then you ask, okay, how do I get there? And the answer is there is a straight path there. And the straight path, however, requires doing some of the things that you wouldn't want to do forever, right? So the point is that if you have to hold your breath, you can hold your breath maybe for a minute, maybe a little bit longer. Some people can do it a little bit longer. Yeah. But you're not going to be able to hold your breath for a day. So you don't want to set up a plan that involves that, right? And if you're doing something for months and months and months, you say, well, I'm not sure I can do that. Mm-hmm. But if it takes a few weeks, there are some people that can't sit at home for a few weeks because they won't get paid. You have to give them money. You have to support them. But remember, that should be part of the plan.
Yeah.
But the point is that what do you need to do? So I've given you a bunch of things. There's one more thing that we need to do, and that's travel restrictions. Mm-hmm. And the reason why that's so important is, think about it the following way. Let's say you're doing this lockdown for the whole country. And you get the cases down. They go down very rapidly because you're doing all the right things. So 2 weeks later, 50% of the country doesn't have it. Then 2 more weeks later, then another quarter of the country doesn't have it. And then, okay, now, but what do? All of these places are waiting. They don't have the disease, but they're going to wait for another few weeks. Mm-hmm. So the key is to stop travel for a few weeks. And the way you stop travel is, well, there are people who have to get to work, right? So, everyone gets ideological about this. They say, no, we can't stop travel. But what about these people that have to go to the hospital? Or what are the people who have to bring the trucks in to do the... So you take a step back and you say, okay, we don't have to stop all travel. Mm-hmm. What we're trying to do is to make sure that we don't get new cases. But if you reduce the transportation by a factor of 10, then you're much less likely to get a case. If you can reduce it by a factor of 100, then you're almost never going to get a case. But it's only for a few weeks. So the point is that you use these travel restrictions and you do it as local as possible. And the reason to do them as local as possible, your town or your block in the city or whatever it is, you say, we're going to make sure, like, people are anyway not going places. So what you do is you say, I'm going to stop travel from my neighborhood to other places, and I'm not going to let other people in unless they absolutely have to. And if they do, well, maybe I'll give them a 14-day quarantine if they're going to come in to stay. And if they're commuters, I'm going to give them careful instructions. You do all of those things, and the point is that you can open up to normal. So what you do is you reward all of the neighborhoods that have done the right thing. And they can say, nah, we're going to get together and go for a barbecue together while you guys over there are still going to be locked down because you haven't gotten rid of the disease. Guess how fast it would happen? I can tell you that from my experience in many parts of the world, as soon as you set it up like that, it's going to be a race to get out of this. Everyone's going to be headed for the exit.
So you're saying
do that, yeah.
The social benefit and the social allure of back to normal will make people rush to do the right things.
I talked with this guy. He's a strong guy. You see that he exercises a lot. He lifts weights and stuff like that. And he was challenging me as I was asking me these questions. And after the third question, he said, I don't agree with lockdowns, but that I would do. Why? Because he wants to go to the bar with his friends. He wants to be able to, who doesn't want to get out of this pandemic? And the point is that all you really have to do is hold your breath for a minute, or the equivalent here is 4 to 6 weeks. Most places, most locations in the country, it's about 4 weeks. And then, many people, because being in cities, it's going to take 6 weeks, and then it's not that much longer. So say it takes a couple more weeks. And by the way, you do have to relax the restrictions carefully. So, all right, so it's 2 months, it's 2.5 months, but we're done with it. And that's super important. It's now one of the questions that people ask me, the next question is, okay, so we could have done this in March. We could have done it in April. Maybe we could have done it in May. Okay, so September we would have done this. By then we should have known We should have all done this and gotten rid of it, because by October we would have been out of this, or, you know, maybe in November. But today we have vaccines, we have all of this stuff. So why should we do it today? So I'm going to answer that question, but maybe you have other questions before I go.
That literally was my question. You nailed it.
Okay. So the answer is, believe it or not, vaccines are a very, very unlikely exit strategy. And that's one statement. The other statement is that even if they're successful, we'll talk about what that means, it's still going to take a bunch of months. There's still going to be hundreds of thousands or 100,000 of people that are going to die. And by the way, we haven't talked about it, but a lot of people now know that many, many people, even if they have mild and asymptomatic cases, end up with what's called long COVID. And that's long-term disability. And this is true also for children, right? So people are talking about opening up schools when there's community transmission and, you know, what is going on to happen. And you know, somewhere between 10 and 50% of children end up with long-term symptoms, and we don't know how that's going to affect them through their whole life. Yeah. And with SARS, 10 years after they had SARS, people couldn't work. They were disabled. So, you know, if you ask me in terms of sort of even, you know, would I do a lot in order to prevent cases over the next few months? Yeah, we care about each other. So it takes 4 to 6 weeks of doing things that we would rather not do, but we'll protect each other. So that's already enough as far as I'm concerned. But it turns out that the vaccines are a very iffy strategy. And the reason is multifold. First of all, again, it takes time. We have to roll out the vaccine. It's going to take still months to get everyone vaccinated, or enough people vaccinated to slow the transmission, to use that as the way we stop the disease. In the meantime, we don't even know how much it slows the transmission. And if you push on any of the experts, they will admit that they're not actually planning to stop the disease. They're planning to live with it like we live with the flu.
Absolutely. That's what I've heard over and over. Yep.
And the flu comes back and back. And even if we could get it to be like the flu, this is 10 times worse than the flu. And how does the flu work? It mutates. So next year it comes back with a different variant. And now we've already seen that we're in the variant brigade. We have the UK variant and the South African variant and the Brazilian variant, and maybe not, there's a California variant. And everyone's saying, okay, well, there are these variants and they're going to be worse. They transmit faster, they're more deadly. And by the way, as you might expect, they evade the vaccine, which is how we have to deal with the flu. Now, this may be good for people who are, you know, sorry to say it, but people who are making profit on vaccines year to year. And that's a tough thing to say, because it is true that they're helping us get out of this and they're creating a very powerful tool. And I surely think that what they've done is incredible. And it's a tremendous contribution what we're doing. But if we rely only on that, that's where we're likely to end up.
Yeah.
And why would we want that when there's an exit? So this is what's happening right now. Let me just say, in the world today, the two advanced parts of the world, right, US and Europe, are fighting this virus, or living with this virus. The virus is going up. We're having these yo-yo lockdowns, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, we have more cases, so more people are ill, and then we have to, you know, so we shut down, and then, you know, we wait a few weeks, and we say, no, it's fewer, then we got to open up. So we open up, the cases go up. This is yo-yo lockdowns. With all of the economic effects, restaurants are dying because they can't, you know, support themselves and so on. And how do we, you know, so this just doesn't work. And across Europe, in Germany, in Ireland, in Italy, in Spain, in France, many people are saying enough with this nonsense. And they're saying this, and they're starting to be pilot projects. So there are communities that are saying, look, you know, maybe the federal government is not going to take action. Many countries have local autonomy. And what they say is, the U.S., some states, they have more local autonomy than others. But if, wherever I would live, I would like my community to get together and say, enough, we can take control. And so this goes back to what people can do. And today, we can get rid of this. But we can't do it as individuals. So one of the things that we need to rebuild is our social community, the people around us. In a city, neighbors, I don't know them. What are they doing? I never made friends with them, that kind of thing. Totally. If you live in a town, then you probably know your neighbors and you know the people down the street. But that's super important because you guys can get together and say, look, it's our choice. We don't have to trust the federal government. We don't have to trust the state government. We can get together and say,
yeah. Problem is, I know my neighbor, so I know I don't trust him. This is the problem, right? Knowing a person doesn't make him any more
one
trustworthy.
Of the things that's important, it's important to know that you actually don't all have to be on board.
Yeah, that's really so. Okay, we only have a couple minutes left because of our time restraints. This is one of my favorite things to ask any scientist that we have on. In your field, so in the field of complex system science, is there pretty uniform agreement on this, or do some people who study the world the way you do with your set of tools, have they concluded differently? Like, is there a debate within your field, or is this a debate of your field compared to the other fields of science?
One of the things, there are very few complexity scientists in the world compared to other scientists. Biologists are the vast majority of scientists, and then you have a few that are chemists, and then much fewer that are physicists. But in any case, if you talk about complexity scientists, which can have all kinds of backgrounds, by the way, there are very few of them by comparison. But a substantial number of the people that I run into that are working on getting rid of this virus are complexity scientists. And complexity scientists are very diverse. They work with all kinds of different tools. And there are almost none of them, very, very, very few, that have actually worked on pandemics before this one. So I can't speak for all of the complexity scientists in the world, but as one of the very few who has worked on pandemics for before this pandemic, I can tell you that, yeah, I mean, this is the way to go. There's no other. I mean, it's, I guess there is something that's super important to say, which is that I'm a scientist, and my role is not to make decisions for people. People are going to make their own decisions. So there might be someone that says, look, hey, I'm never going to wear a mask. It's not me. I'm not willing to do it. And there are other people that are going to say, hey, this business about, going to a place where, I'm going to be there for a couple of weeks, even though I'm not super feeling bad, but I have, the disease. Yeah, I don't think we're going to do that. No. And all of these other things, hey, we're just, I don't care about other people. There are people who are going to say, I'm just not going to do any of this stuff. My statement is an entire society can make a choice. And the US has made a choice so far. And I don't feel like, it's my responsibility to make that choice for other people. It's surely not my role. All I can do is say, look, if you do this, this is going to be the outcome.
Got it.
And if you do that, right, and this is in the Bible, right? You have the choice of life and death, right? In the at a particular point, and it's, I guess you could say even God didn't decide for people; He gave people the choice.
Right.
And as a scientist, I have an ability to tell you. I mean, that's what the science is for. To help you understand what the consequences are of the actions that you choose to make. But it's not my responsibility to make that choice. So you've got You've got my information about what I think can be done. And the main thing is that if you want to work on this, and they can give
Right.
you a link, but we have the zero COVID groups all over the country. So that if you look at zerocovid.us, you can sign up and join with other people that are already ready to do this. That's a choice that you can make. And if you don't, or if not enough people make that choice, well, the US will probably end up living with this for a long time.
Yeah. And I guess, some of the decisions have been made already, and now we're trying to catch up to those. The way the Biden team has responded to this certainly seems different than what the Trump team did a year ago. I can't imagine that we would have been in this same place had there been different decision makers. And so now there's some decisions that have to be made going forward now. And, Professor Bar-Yam, I'm so excited to hear this, but it just feels to me like, wow, we are moving the other direction now. Right. We are moving into opening, and we've chosen a vaccine route. And I just, I'd love to have you back on and say, okay, in light of that, those sets of conditions, what now?
Well, let me just say,
scientists say,
let me just say,
reality.
There are some places have decided that way, and some people.
Yeah,
in other words, some states have decided, and not everyone is doing that. And there's still a choice. And one of the things that's going to happen, no doubt, is in the places that are opening up, there are going to be more cases. And that's going to happen because of the new variants. It's going to happen in a few weeks because that's clearly the trajectory of what's happening.
Yeah.
And some places sooner than later. So when you watch Florida, have the trajectory, you say, well, hey, the scientists that I heard said that this is going to happen where I live if we don't take action, and maybe you can get ahead of it and prevent that from happening.
Well, thank you for your good work. Thank you for being with us today and for being so generous with your time and so clear about this. It's really, really, really helpful.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Take care. I'd love to come back.
Oh, we'll have you back. And I know you're off to teach a class right now. So thank you for caring for the students too, and for teaching the students.
Take care.
Hey, that is, I'm going to read the bio so I get it all right. That's Dr. Yaneer Bar-Yam. He's a complex systems scientist and pandemic expert with a PhD in physics from MIT. And he's the president of the New England Complex Systems Institute and founder of the End Coronavirus Coalition. You can find that at zerocovid.us. Wow, Dan, I mean, it really, every time we have a scientist on, my mind bends open and bends around another way, right? Because you're just like, well, okay, there's another level of possibility. And I guess it just is a little heartbreaking to me to think that the certain nations' narratives, the United States being chief among them, is just not set to respond to a pandemic.
Yeah.
Right? Like, feels like the things we hold close, the things that we think define us, how we're going to be, what our patterns and habits are, we are susceptible to pandemics because the thing you would have to do to respond to a pandemic are things we are unlikely to do. Now, maybe when the next one comes,
unwilling to do. Yeah.
Yes. Maybe the next one, people will say, hey, we don't want one of those 18-month slow drip.
Yeah. What if
things.
we nip it in the bud this time?
Let's hit it harder. Maybe this could sort of get us there so that there's nothing, so that the other one doesn't come. But man, I'll tell you, the number of people that I know, if we had shut down this country for 4 weeks or 6 weeks or did something very aggressive like that, and it didn't manifest, people didn't die, they would have been saying that was all wag the dog stuff. That was all unnecessary. I mean, I literally hear it now. I have really good, really important people in my life that say to me like, oh, I mean, this is unbelievable. I mean, all we've had, barely more people have died than to, name a thing. And I'm like, it would have been, and that's all with the shutdown.
Right.
So I can't, and these are not people that are against any of this stuff. They're just trying to make sense out of it. So
Yeah.
I hear what he's saying, and yet I just think that version of science when it comes to a pandemic, we are not prepared to believe this one.
Right.
I
Well,
don't
it's
know.
like Tiffany said on Facebook. She said, I agree with everything being said. Logically, a nationwide lockdown is not going to happen. My state is already getting ready to have a mask burning in May. It feels very hopeless. I feel like Dr. Bar-Yam, his whole thing as a scientist is like, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. He's presented like, if we want to beat this, we can beat it in 4 to 6 weeks. But it takes all of us, or at least 80% of us, being on board to stomp this out.
And look, I mean, I remember people, I remember his paper now that he mentions it. I remember it being in the news and people talking about it and people saying, here's what we can do. This is what you have to do. And decision makers and across the political spectrum looked at that and said, no way. No way are we doing that. And I actually think, and I'm going to be generous to the former president for just a moment. I think he heard this kind of thing and said, if we move aggressively, we can shut it down in 4 or 6 weeks. That got in his head. Then we did some level of shutdown that he said to himself and other people said to him, this is that, so it's going to go away. Right? But we didn't do the aggressive level of things.
Yeah.
And I distinctly remember being on the Vote Common Good bus and Cole, our bus driver, showing me videos of people, authorities in China going to people's houses, taking them out of their houses. They didn't go willingly in these videos. They were being dragged out by people in hazmat suits because they were diagnosed with the virus and taken away. And so like that narrative in January was around, right? So this is the, next time love to ask him about complexity systems science, because it says the conditions are what tell you the moment. So what is the complexity systems response if you know that we're in a country that's not going to shut down? I mean, like the level of shutdown we currently had, that was more than this country will tolerate. But frankly, I think, and maybe he'd make this argument, if you look at places where there are huge outbreaks and huge shutdowns, first being New York and then it followed in other places, they didn't get rid of it to zero, but the numbers dropped significantly. Right. And then they came back. And this is the part that I don't know, because the people predict, I wanted to ask him this too, but the people predicting the numbers, they were saying it's going to go in some cycles. So I'm interested in that. Like, would it really have fully shut down would it have shut the spigot off in this country because by the time, it feels like by the time we knew about it, it was already so deeply embedded in this country, or by the time the population knew about it, like by March, it was raging in this, obviously, because that's why 30,000 people died in New York in 2 weeks. It was clearly here. Yeah. I guess I'm having to process this one a little bit.
Right. It makes me think of, it seems like a narrative problem. Like we've made it into a political thing and you have to take sides. Are you pro-mask? Are you anti-mask? Which side are you on? And I just feel like if there was compassionate leadership from the top on day one, even suggesting like, we follow the science, what a difference that would have made. I think about, like, what if Trump had come out, he was anti-mask for so long. What if he had just come out early on and issued, he's got the Trump mask. He could have made tons of money and had people wearing masks. He could have made it a positive thing.
Right. Who got in his head? But then I do wonder, Dan, true, and I'm only being a little snarky about myself here. Would I have worn a mask if Donald Trump told me to wear a mask? I don't know. Like I felt in such opposition to that guy. So I don't know, right? Like I don't know which way it works. I mean, we're so divided that but you're right. I mean, maybe I would have said, well, the scientists say it, that's good enough for me, and then Trump says it, and that's good enough for his cult followers, and that would have gotten us a whole lot further. Or vaccines the same way. Like the fact that now the word is out that in January he and his family received the vaccine at the White House and didn't tell anyone about it, and still won't confirm it, even though the White House officially did confirm it. So even on this, and then when he did wear a mask, he hid away and wore a mask in private, but then when he was out in public, took it off. Like, what was going on in his head? And we had time to get to masks because masks weren't first. Shutdown was first. Don't touch things at grocery stores was next. And then this one was masks really came quite late in the game, right?
Yeah, Gary says on Facebook, it was just like 9/11. There was a moment right when things shut down where peace was possible, where there was a golden moment to lead. I think that's really accurate. It seemed to be a wasted moment of unity in those first few weeks.
And and again, I mean, we don't need to spend time a year ago or with the former twice impeached failed president, but the story that was unfolding from Donald Trump was this thing has to go away now. Like his whole power of positive thinking nonsense and only say good things, never say, but like that's what got in his head, I think, is that he just couldn't. He comes from a line of thinking that shows up in many religions. There's a version of it in many religions. There's a version of it in non-religious communities. This power of positive thinking and only the power of attraction, and never say anything that's kind of negative and don't dwell on those things. And that's why he never apologizes. And that's why he never talks about anything that's bad. And he doesn't want to hear any bad news. And all of that is actually from a worldview that he operates in. And COVID was so contrary to that worldview that there was no way forward for that person with that worldview to lead the nation in an honest way. It's just I think you're right. There are narratives, and sometimes there's narratives in leaders individually, and then those narratives become part of the rest of the country. And we're in a, but honestly, I think, look, had it been Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton who was president at that time, and they tried to put shutdowns in place.
Well, we saw what that would have looked like in Michigan when Governor Whitmer put some pretty aggressive restrictions on that arguably saved lives, but people plotted to kidnap and execute her because of that.
Yes.
Like we know what that would look like.
So maybe you're right that Trump allowed people to be comfortable enough with the shutdown because he was sort of in for that until he wasn't, until he wrote "Liberate Michigan" on Twitter. I mean, don't forget the fact that the guy was saying on one hand, we need to be doing this isolation, shutdown, distancing, and then said, but not in any of the states in the country that have Democratic governors. Just really something. But as oddball as Trump is, as dangerous, as incompetent, all that, I'm not sure that this country would go along with it no matter whom it was. There would be someone leading the charge. People would come around that leading of that charge. I mean, I think of myself as fairly reasonable, as I think everyone thinks of themselves. Right? Like, who's the person that's like, no, I'm actually terribly
quite
unreasonable,
unhinged.
And I don't take new ideas in, and I despise people who differ with me. No one, including me. I don't see myself that way. But I've been rather perplexed, confused, doubting of the responses across the board of the many voices that are trying to say what we should do going forward. Right. I mean, it was such a cacophony of confusion that trying to feel comfortable or even feel like you could explain it beyond just like, I don't know, that's what they said. Just do it or don't do it, And then what they said is only dependent on what the particular thing they were talking about, and it doesn't apply to everything else. I just sense that this country has a certain set of vulnerabilities, and a pandemic, as it turns out, is one of them. And I'm not sure that we're prepared as a nation to actually respond to these things. this could be the greatest weakness of the United States, right? Is that something that would require great sacrifice? And then I've heard, and again, it could be the former failed president that's in my head. The number of times that he would say, well, China doesn't report the real numbers, or Taiwan doesn't report the real numbers, or every time somebody would say other nations have crushed this thing and it's not spreading, and the United States has the most cases and the most deaths. It's worse in the United States, which is true statistically. There's people who say Trump was the first, and many people say, well, you can't trust the numbers from the other countries. They're lying about their numbers.
So and I don't have a high level of trust for China, but
see, that's what I was getting at. So you hear this thing where they say like, well, other countries have shut it down. And then you say, did they though? There's a little piece. Now, I don't
But then you have New Zealand and Australia. Yeah. They're having concerts and music festivals and just loving life right now. Oh, yeah.
I heard him say that. And then people say stuff. And when I say people, I mean me. They say stuff like, well, yeah, when you're in an enormously large landmass with a very small population, when you have a landmass the size of North America and a population the size of Iowa, yeah, people spread out. They don't have as much contact. Urban centers aren't as big. There's just nothing like the United States.
Apples and oranges, yeah.
But then there's China, and then there's India, and then there's huge population centers in Africa. So if those places really if the numbers are accurate of what's coming out of those places, then there really is an apples to apples comparison. Now it might be the Granny Smith apple compared to the Honeycrisp apple, but they're apple to apple comparisons where you can say we have a worse case in the United States than there was in the other states, other than there were in the other countries that are comparable, and you can't continue to. The thing that's different is how the people of the United States will respond to these kinds of edicts, or that the Lord God of the universe is judging this nation because of the sin of Donald Trump as president. There's always that option, which I don't hear any religious people saying. But can you imagine, had it been Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton, what the religious people would have been saying about the rationale for this, that this was a curse upon us because of our federal leadership? So there's always that option, which I don't hold to. So it must be the something else. And it seems like one of the options is this one. That it's just in us how we're, and look, if that's the case, then we build that in, right? We say, we think there's a lot of benefits that come in this country from being the way that we are. And that comes with some liabilities. And one of our great liabilities is a pandemic. So let's build a response system that can be adequate to, in other words, this particular car is an RV, and this RV has a refrigerator in it. So we have to accommodate for the refrigerator, to borrow the professor's analogy. And so, I don't know, we have to just consider the fact that we're not just a car. We have this other thing that we have to figure out how to run and operate. And that's going to mean there's some places we can't go, some things we can't do, some things we can do. And that's all built in.
And so if only someone had written a playbook for what to do in the event of a pandemic.
Yes.
Oh,
if
wait,
that had existed, what if that was around?
What if that was around and people opened it and read it?
And read it and did it. But, and they look, there's a lot of people whose argument is we were too reactionary to this one with what we did. If you had followed the pandemic playbook, that I think, which sounds an awful lot like what Dr. Bar-Yam was saying.
And Gary on Facebook, we had one. I was being sarcastic. We were referencing the Obama pandemic playbook that was ripped up by the Trump administration and thrown out. So
yes, yeah, and ignored and mocked and ridiculed and all. Yeah, but had they followed that sort of page by page, it would have meant the kind of response that Professor suggested. And people would have been very discomforted by that, right? I'm not sure. I think we have to have it out in our country. Like, would people make the calculation that it was worth it. You know, I don't know. This feels like the kind of thing that you really do want to have this. I think when Trump and the rest of the country was faced with people looking at him and saying, if you do nothing, 2 million people will be dead in this next year, right? That was the prediction. And if you do it, what we're saying, 500,000 people or whatever the number was, 350, I think they were saying was going to die. It's been a bit more than that, or almost double that. So there was a calculation made, do nothing, this number, do this and this number. The idea that it was going to get to zero was, I think, well beyond by the time it became public, was well beyond, it wasn't zero. The number was never going to be zero. And that's a hard thing for this country to have to reconcile, is that we have to make these kinds of decisions, which is why, to make a final point here before we close out after the longest podcast in the history of our podcast, that you have to have a common good criteria for this stuff, right? And it has to be something, there's something that's going to guide you, and the good for all, the common good, feels like that should be in the mix. But that's not something that we're talking about. It's not easy to talk about that in the midst of a crisis. And when you have to make a decision, it's better to talk about that in the other times, so that when a decision needs to be made, you've already been in the conversation. So we should be developing and hopefully we'll keep the conversation going about where we are on this particular response. But man, even after Biden last night, and I thought it was great. I'm a huge, supporter of Biden. I thought that was just terrific what he did last night in his speech and the decisions they've made, and all for it. But to just recognize that people want to be done with this. So when he said, just think by the 4th of July, maybe something could look more typical for how you'd spend your 4th of July. I mean, people have went to their calendars and put end of COVID day, right? COVID is done. It's like a D-Day in a war. And so I think people aren't going to want to talk about this. I think people are going to want to take those masks and put them in a little Ziploc and stick them in their keepsake spot and be done with this. So I am not confident that this country is not fundamentally vulnerable to a pandemic going forward, even after all of this. Yeah. All right.
Good
Anything
stuff.
Else?
No. World record length of podcast day. So
it's like pandemic long. It's like it's pandemic length.
I could tell you had a good rant just waiting for the end of that. So
Oh, really? Was I giving fidgety clues?
It's just always in there.
Yeah, always, totally. Oh my gosh. The only person benefited by the person benefited greatest by this opportunity for me to rant down here in the bunker is
Shelley
my wife,
Padgett.
who then doesn't have to feel like she has to put up with it upstairs until later in the day. She's like, "Didn't you have the podcast today where you could tell everybody what you think about that?" Oh, she doesn't say that.
Oh, that's awesome.
All right. Hey, thanks all. We'll be back on Monday and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday next week is what we do around here. If you're already part of our Vote Common Good world and you follow the podcast, thank you. If you watch us do this live, thank you. If you're on our mailing list, double thank you. If you're a contributor to what we do, it's literally the only way we have time, energy, and money to do this is your contributions. You can do that over at votecommongood.com. We don't give you anything but our goodwill. So there's no exchange of services, but you do get all this. So see us over there at votecommongood.com, and we'll see you Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday next week.
Bye, everybody.